Welcome to A State of Mind, the podcast that brings together consciousness, meditation, mindfulness, psychology, psychedelics, and so much more in pursuit of this mystery we call life. This is Julian Royce. Thank you for tuning in. Today's episode, let's see, this is coming out the day before Halloween, or some people are calling it Samhain, I believe is the pronunciation, which is a more pagan name for a Celtic holiday that Halloween kind of co-opted. There's an amazing history of Christianity co-opting pagan traditions. So a lot of the more ancient traditions didn't just disappear, but were kind of adopted or co-opted into the kind of Christian understanding. And that's relevant to today's episode. For the first time I'm speaking with two other people, and it's all about magic and ritual and paganism. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. I want to mention we are also a few days away from our presidential election, and it will be a great relief when this is all over, I hope. Hopefully things will be peaceful. But I wanted to mention again this idea of ranked choice voting. The last episode was all about it. Just briefly want to say, I think it just makes so much sense. It's such a great idea. It's being used successfully in places like Australia, in elections in Europe, and in local elections across the United States. And here in Boulder, Colorado, there is a measure on the ballot to approve ranked choice voting for our mayor. So hopefully that will become more and more common. And to put it in a nutshell, ranked choice voting, instead of just choosing one person for a position, you can rank your choices. Say there were 10 people running, you could rank, here's my first choice, here's my number one choice, here's my number two choice, here's my number three choice. And what that does is you get to vote for the person you really believe in without fear that your vote will be wasted. And if that person you put as your number one choice gets less than 50% of the votes, your vote will go towards your number two choice. And if they get less than 50%, it'll go towards your number three choice. So some of the details of how all that plays out is a little bit complicated, and we talked about it in the last episode. But the basic idea is so simple, and it makes so much sense. And I'm just imagining if we adopted this on a national level, the effects that it would have. For example, to be a participant on the presidential debate stage, right now I think the rule, whoever makes these things up, you have to get 15% in a poll of people, 15% support. So with ranked choice voting, with more people empowered to support the people they actually believe in, it would be much easier for third parties like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or whoever to be able to get that 15%, to be able to participate in the debates, for example, and then they would be sharing their ideas. Our national political conversation could be more nuanced, more intelligent, and there would be an incentive for the leading candidates to win over the voters of the other candidates. So I think it would contribute to a situation with less polarization. A useful way to understand our political dysfunction is to look at the incentives. Like right now, there's an incentive to engage in this hyper-polarization, partisanship, to just attack the other side, to have a lot of negativity, because voters at the ballot box are only given two choices. And if you've successfully thrown enough mud at your opponent, then you'll look a little better by comparison. But if we had ranked choice voting, and there were 4 or 5 viable candidates, and you could vote for the person you actually really wanted to vote for, and then you had another candidate who made overtures to what you believed in and made some compromises, maybe you put them down as number 2, so they would effectively end up getting your vote, but they would have done it through maybe conversation or cooperation or debate, like actual debate, rather than just name calling and all the nonsense we have going on now. So anyway, check out that episode if you missed it. In today's episode, like I said, it's all about magic and witchcraft. I haven't had a conversation like this before on the podcast. I have a master's of religious studies, so I have a long-lasting interest in religion and spirituality in general. And today I'm speaking with Samuel McCabe and Lisa Jane. And Samuel describes himself as a ceremonial magician, and he talks more about what that means. And Lisa Jane describes herself as a pagan green anarchist. And so one of the things I learned through this conversation was some of the differences between, people who might call themselves a witch or a Wiccan or an occultist or a pagan. And we discussed some of the history, which I think is so fascinating, with Europe and Christianity and these more indigenous folk traditions from Europe that were in some ways suppressed by Christianity. In some ways, some of the traditions were carried on in different ways. And I share some fascinating similarities with Tantric or Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhist practices. Tibetan Buddhism basically is Tantric Buddhism, and it has a ton of magical practices in it that have some amazing similarities with some esoteric occult practices from the West. I think, different traditions of Buddhism have different kinds of more folk and magical practices across Asia. And so I think there is a parallel. There's obviously a lot of differences, but there's a parallel in the way that Christianity became the dominant religion across Europe. Buddhism in parts of Asia became the dominant religion. And in the case of Buddhism, it often did not get rid of local practices and traditions, but kind of brought them in, gave them a Buddhist spin, and included them. I think in a way that was less aggressive and less oppressive than was often the case with Christianity. And the kind of madness and oppression with Christianity reached its peak with, the Inquisition and the witch burnings and all of that. So I thought this was a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. This is my first podcast with 3 people. So I'm here today with Samuel McCabe and Lisa Jane. Lisa Jane, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm an artist and a pagan green anarchist. I practice Zen Buddhism for almost 10 years, and I've worked freelancing and a lot of post-production media stuff.
Nice. And Samuel?
Cool. I'm a ceremonial magician and tarot reader, and I practice a Solomonic tradition of ceremonial magic.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. So we're going to be talking a little bit about magic and occultism and some interesting things.
'Tis the season.
Yes.
And me and Lisa Jane met through the Psychedelic Sangha.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been holding these psychedelic integration groups where people can talk about their experiences and get to know each other, have community, have support around it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The Psychedelic Sangha is a movement seated primarily in New York and San Francisco. Julian and I are trying to launch a branch out here.
We are
launching a branch, yes. And so right now the activity we're most focused on is just offering people a space to talk about and then, bring their experiences with the medicines back into their everyday lives. Because, that was the big failure of the 60s, right? There wasn't that kind of safety net to allow people to have these extraordinary experiences and then come back to everyday reality and say, oh, wow, what do I do with this? And our group tries to help people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people ask me what integration work is about, and I don't really like the word work, but integration, whatever you want to call it, integrating experiences, and it doesn't have to be psychedelics, but intense peak experiences that we've had, and we can often forget them if we don't talk about them. We can help anchor them in our system and make them more real if we share them and we can explore them, see the meaning there, make them more meaningful.
Absolutely. And meditation can bring on these type of experiences. Sometimes people just have them spontaneously. Certainly ritual work can do it.
Yeah. So, and then, and you're also practicing, how would you describe would you call yourself an occultist? What's the right?
I consider myself a pagan green anarchist. I draw upon a lot of different traditions. I use my magic in a political way, and which supports my anarchist political beliefs, which, contrary to what most people think of with anarchism, which is the colloquial term kind of fuck shit up Can I say
Yeah,
fuck?
you can say
Okay,
that.
all right. And like, destroy all authority of the state. It is very much about like operating without a boss, but at the same time having like a social consciousness, right? It's like
so pagan green anarchist, is that what you're saying?
yes.
Interesting. So pagan meaning you believe in different gods?
Yeah, I take a pantheistic approach to the universe, right? I believe there are energies. I think that a life force is found in everything in our world and in the cosmos, and I try to operate with respect for that. I've studied different occult practices such as chaos magic. I've done some ritual magic work, but I know that's more Samuel's forte. I actually conjured a demon with Samuel. Yes, and I try to take that and incorporate it into my art practice.
Yeah.
Just my general.
The connection between paganism and the earth, environment, and the word green, like that makes sense to me. And are you familiar with panpsychism? It's this idea that all of reality is imbued with consciousness to some degree, and I think that a lot of mystical traditions, including Buddhism, speak about that like consciousness is all pervasive, or awareness. Like some traditions will distinguish between consciousness and awareness is kind of a more fundamental level of reality, but the idea being that what we often consider inanimate, like a rock or a crystal or a planet or a star, or space, there's consciousness there, there's awareness there.
That's absolutely pagan of you to say.
Okay, I thought there would be a connection.
For sure.
It would be, some people are really, some scientists are working with these philosophers to try to find a way to prove that. Is that true or not? To be able to test that. And that may never be possible to prove scientifically, but I think it's a fascinating inquiry.
Yeah, because how do you test the objective reality of, the subjective reality of an object outside of itself?
Well, to make it more kind of relatable, it's very difficult to prove externally that consciousness exists at all, and yet that's the one thing that we all know is true. I know that I'm conscious, that I'm having thoughts, that I'm having an experience, but it's hard to say, you could see another person, maybe they're a robot, maybe they're not. It's hard to actually prove,
right, that everything
prove
is
that
in a
something else is having a consciousness. Yeah.
That's
an interesting thing to think about.
The hard question of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, we all have our beliefs in how we operate and navigate the world, right? Even atheists, they have a belief, which is there is no deity that created everything, and it's something they stand by sometimes very dogmatically, but at the end of the day, we all find meaning for ourselves, right? And that's just part of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the meaning that we give things.
Yeah. And with paganism, I think it's trying to be in tune with these other energies or life forces going on around us.
And that they could affect us, influence us. What's an example of how you are a pagan? What does that mean? Do you talk to trees? Do
I talk to trees? Well, I mentioned before I practice Zen Buddhism, and I find meditation can get you to a different state of mind, just like psychedelics can bring you to an altered state of consciousness, where you actually experientialize a connection beyond yourself with the world. And I think through pagan ritual, where there's so many different approaches, right? But for me, I like to meditate in a space out in nature. I often do some artwork there, but I will just spend time sitting, letting things be around me, and just start to feel kind of my place there and showing gratitude. I do a lot of different types of work. I have an altar. I do daily, sort of ancestral gratitude and blessings. And, I call upon certain entities from a wide variety of cultures and traditions that I'm kind of showing reverence for.
So it's very open to different traditions. Part of my curiosity here is paganism. It's not a particular school that's rejects other ways of thinking.
No, I think
it seems very open.
Yeah, a lot of folks think of it as Wicca. And Wicca was, Samuel, correct me if I'm wrong on this history, it was sort of like this guy Alan Gardner really brought this revival in Great Britain back in like the 70s, 60s and 70s. Was it earlier even?
It was earlier than that. Gerald Gardner was inspired by the writings and the teachings and the rituals of Aleister Crowley, and wanted to create England's next religion. And so developed Wicca based on Thelema, which is it's a ceremonial magic religion that kind of came out of the Golden Dawn, which is another one. Kind of going back into like Victorian theosophy and religion that way. But I wanted to create England's next religion, and so developed Wicca.
Interesting. So it's very consciously an intention to create a new religion, based on older forms. And Aleister Crowley's like such a famous, like, kind of infamous figure. Like, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Like, what is his connection?
His connection to like.
Well, I mean, like I guess, like, how should, like, does he deserve to be so infamous? Like, was he?
I said like, so Aleister Crowley had a lot of really good writing, and a lot of, again, like kind of what Lisa Jane is talking about, a lot of tributaries going into this current. And so, Crowley pulled in Eastern meditation and yoga, even, pulled in some of the grimoire tradition from Western Europe, also the lodge system of the Masonic lodge. So pulled all these things together, but the pinnacle point was around was in 1904 when he received this book of the law, which the famous line of "Do what thou wilt, show you the whole of the law," and then love and
which
love
could sound so egotistical, right?
That's so.
Is that a misunderstanding?
I think so. Yeah, I think the driving force of Thelema, which is Greek for will, is to discover your will and follow your will, and that is your only true purpose in life, is to discover and follow your will. And so, there's then the thing comes in where if you were following your will, you wouldn't interfere with someone else's will. And so it kind of folds in this idea that it's not do whatever you want, it's do your will. So
the idea that it wouldn't interrupt someone else's?
Right. So, generally, murder would be something that would be interfering with someone else's will. And so you would not necessarily be doing your will. It could be art, some Thelemites could argue that out, but which we're, known to do. But the main thing is, really finding that source and that will, usually through this spirit called the Holy Guardian Angel, which, over the course of years and dedication. Yeah, there's a lot of different, again, with Crowley taking a lot of sources and turning them, or kind of evolving them into this religion. The Holy Guardian Angel is a concept that comes from a particular grimoire that has Jewish roots. And so discovering your Holy Guardian Angel is kind of your higher power or will.
So it's an individual...
It's an individual thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, like my general sense of it is that there were obviously all these different pagan traditions and pre-Christian traditions, and then Christianity came along and did its best to get rid of them. Kind of culminating in the witch burnings and all that madness, and then later it's kind of like a rediscovery. I mean, in some sense, these traditions were never fully stamped out, obviously, but they were suppressed to the point where it doesn't seem like there's an unbroken lineage in the way that, like, Buddhism or like indigenous traditions in America or in Asia maybe or Africa, like it's like disrupted this history of like oppression and trying to survive underground. Is that accurate?
Well, I think it was really bad around the time of the Inquisition. And then
as bad as it could possibly get.
And the Age of Reason sprung up almost simultaneously. But even during the witch trials and things, high magic still kind of had place. It was taught at certain universities in Europe.
really?
Alchemists and astrologers, that kind of thing was considered actually like courtly, or it was, it continued. And Newton, Isaac Newton was like a big time occultist.
Yeah, I've heard that. He's
even
a huge
though,
alchemist.
but Newtonian science is part of what the scientism that has like kind of tried to debunk like all religion, which is funny that he himself had a very spiritual core, I believe. But when it comes to the Western European kind of folk magic traditions, that it was horrible, and then though it found ways to continue through the culture. I think that when you think about the UK, let's say Cornwall, Wales, Scottish Highlands, these traditions still clung. They still to this day, they talk about cunning folk. Yeah, and I think in the States where cunning folk. If somebody has a gift, like they know when where missing items are, or they can like foresee it's something that's going to occur in the near future. They're still referred to as cunning folk, and they still exist. And
makes you think of Harry Potter, which by the way is like one of the most successful stories or series ever created. So it's clearly like speaks to a deep need and longing we have to connect with some of these ideas and and
the ideas are about the mystery of what's beyond the self, right? And with Harry Potter, it's the kids are in a place where they can cultivate this, and it's just very magical, right? It's this excitement about going there, and it's kind of the same excitement people who are psychonauts or people who are deep practitioners of any mystical tradition. I wouldn't limit that to paganism, as you were talking before, outside of the podcast about Tibetan Buddhism having this deep mystical tradition.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think, to be fair, Christianity does as well. Like, if we talk about magic, there's evangelical or so-called fundamentalists or Roman Catholics who are like really into like different kinds of spiritual practices. They have different experiences. They connect with the divine in different ways. So I think if we talk about accessing something beyond the ego, some kind of spiritual experience or state or divine communion or connecting to something bigger than ourselves, it's obviously what a lot of religion is about. So it's not like the Christians are evil and the pagans are good, or at least I don't, it's too simplistic. And it's also not like these aren't possibilities for everyone, right? That's what I believe.
Like Swedenborg, like he was the mystical Christian, like that so many Europeans started following.
The Meister Eckhart.
Jacob Bohm.
St. Francis
of Assisi. Swedenborg.
William Blake.
William Blake. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I don't. It wasn't like a clear cut. At this point, the church totally eradicated paganism. It was a process, and it was a process of as Christianity, migrated west, it would be encountering different cultures along the way, and would have to come up with ways of integrating the Christianity. And I use integrating it's a very mild word. Integrating the Christian values into the cultures.
Often with force, is that what you mean?
Often with force, yes, absolutely with force, and with a lot of pen and ink, because a lot of it was written, canons or laws of getting rid of divination, demonizing divination. And what's interesting though is the similarities between magic and miracles. They run very concurrently. You can look at them from the healings, and then you can cross compare them maybe with some grimoire magic or something like that. They're very, very similar.
Well, that's interesting.
But the difference though that the church distinguished was the fact that miracles were done through God. Right. Magic's done through demons, which is
and who gets to decide which is which? Right?
Yeah.
That's what
yeah, and Christianity started out with it was very death-centric. You could really just call it a cult of saints. The people that were martyred in the name of Christianity, they were revered. Their relics were preserved in different shrines and churches and things like that. So it was very death-heavy, but as the Catholic Church split off from that, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church retained a lot of that cult of saints kind of concept, But as things went from Catholicism then to Protestantism, you get things like, the Puritans and the Salem witch trials and stuff like that.
Yeah, because in Europe, the Inquisition led a lot of it, but then also the Anglicans. And then, over in the States, it was the Protestants, the Calvinists.
The Puritans.
So...
Well, I guess one thing I just wanted to share, like when I first was getting into meditation when I was like 18, I remember like realizing or learning that because it was such a new thing for me, and it was something I was associating mostly with the East. But then I realized that some of the more Bible thumping, I don't know if fundamentalists is what they would call themselves, but fundamentalist Christians were like the other people, because I grew up in the South, like they were also going into intense prayer, like the holy rollers, like people who would like roll with poisonous snakes and like speak in tongues, and they were accessing altered states of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so I gained a certain, I don't know what the word is, affinity or respect for that part of their practice or their life. Like it's not, whereas a lot of people like make fun of that and somehow mindfulness is acceptable, but if you're doing that, it's like...
I think part of the problem I read recently, what book was it in? I can't remember because I'm going back during the pandemic and rereading some Crowley, and I can't remember if it was in the Crowley or if it was in this other book on tarot I'm reading by Alejandro Jodorowsky. I'm rereading that one. But anyway, it says that anytime that the religion is monotheistic, it is very dictatorial. And that when it's pantheistic, the religion tends to be looser. And I think the problem with the Christians, for me, not just as a pagan, but just kind of taking a step back and looking at that, because I also, as somebody who was raised kind of secular Jewish, I had to go to vacation Bible school in the South because I had to work my uncle's farm every summer, and he wanted me to make friends. So he sent me to a Southern Baptist vacation Bible school. And this guy, he was put in the fear of hell and fire and brimstone, and it was almost like he went into a trance.
Right.
And he was just communicating this like rush of the Lord that came through him to like will these children to like become not just saved but baptized. And me and this girl who sat with me because she thought I was cool because I was from out of state, we were the only two who were not saved and baptized. And I think she probably took some like rough...
That's intense to be the only one in a group like that.
Yeah.
And to have that fear and the hellfire, and there's a lot of...
To be 8 years old,
There's a lot of reason why the negative stereotypes are out there.
That's right, yeah. So I mean,
I don't want to defend that,
but I can see where you're coming from about seeing it as like something deeper, like on a spiritual level.
But I remember as a child, like I was surrounded. My family was not religious, but I was surrounded by. I was in the Bible Belt, Christian people, and the thing that I never could accept. I remember being like 5 years old and thinking about this was this idea that like if you don't do it this one way, you go to hell for eternity, and they would even go. I remember asking they would even go back and past. So people who were born before Jesus or whatever are either in purgatory or they're in hell, but they can't get to heaven because they were born before. And I was like, that makes no sense.
Yeah.
And then you apply it to everyone living today, and it just makes no sense. So that is the extreme version of this kind of monotheistic, like this way or the highway. And,
there's. For me, I think of Christianity as has a layer of social control, to it. But when I go and I read like the Church Fathers. And saints' lives and things like this, and church mothers too. There's this piety and this asceticism that really kind of, for me, strikes me as that consciousness seeking. What you two are talking about, like there is like Meister Eckhart, a good example of these mystics, these Christian mystics. It seems like orthodoxy is kind of where things start to get difficult to find wiggle room, obviously, but I think looking at like the mystical writings, you get a sense of it, like the Cloud of Unknowing. It's a really amazing.
It's a beautiful text.
Yes.
And I guess just to wrap up my thoughts on this, like mysticism is one thing, and like respecting that drive to like discover some greater truth or absolute truth or consciousness, but then some of these great mystics or church people or whoever they are then go into the political realm, and they could be so oppressive. So it's amazing how humans can experience some aspects of the divine, and then they can turn around and think it's good to like kill all the pagans or all, burn the witches or whatever it is. So it's just we can't. It's amazing how religion has failed to elevate our overall morality and respect for life, right? Our overall.
I think Houston Smith said that religion is beautiful. It's when man gets involved that it falls apart. And you think about that, even like in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, the Buddhists were killing the Muslims.
The Rohingya.
Yeah. I mean,
it's still going on, I think, unfortunately.
It's like, how do you wrap your head around it? It's always like when you get a group that wants to have like control. And I think that's what it comes back to. And with paganism, unlike ritual high magic, I think you really kind of, at least for my understanding and my interpretations, like it takes a more deep ethological approach where you kind of sit with nature and allow things to be. Like you see, how can I have gratitude for this? How can I revere this?
It's very nature-based.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And with Zen, I think that's part of what I liked about Zen is that, the cosmology of it, it's there. If you want to start digging, you can find things, Dogen. There's system in place. A bit of a hierarchy in terms of like teacher student, but at the same time it's really about just sitting and then watch what happens, and then you go through something called Dokusan, which a lot of Americans like to call it like the Buddhist confession, like confession, but they you go and you talk
before the teacher
and you talk, it's in private, and so you can sit and talk about your meditation experiences and get guidance. But what I found through Zen, unlike, let's say like Shambhala or like even Vipassana, which I've sat, they tend to like, I don't know, it's a lot more free. It's sort of like the teachers often say, well, what do you think? And where do you see this going? Or what feels good to you? Versus the kind of guru
structure. Sort of telling you this is it's the way it is. It's more of a discovery.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I want to hear more about this. So the distinction between high magic and you're talking about paganism. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I tend to call it ceremonial magic.
Okay.
Usually, there's kind of this distinction of high magic versus low magic. High magic being angelic, low magic being like sorcery or summoning spirits, things like that. So that there's, again, it goes back to that kind of like duality feel to things, like high magic's good, low magic's bad, something like this. I use the word ceremonial magic because the path that I'm on, I'm working with angels as well as demons. And so it's I might be working with some angels for this, either, usually angels will teach you things. So, different angels teach different things. And so if I'm wanting to contact an angel, I find an appropriate hour and day using, I have apps for that now, but I have a planetary hour app, and so I'll find the right planetary
So the
hour.
right time?
The timing is important, very much so.
Like,
So
is that astrology?
Astrology is a component of it. It's different than like natal chart astrology. It's more back to like Ptolemy and how the different planets interact with each other and influence things. And so that's, I'm finding a good time for that. And then...
how would you know? I guess you got the app.
I have an app, but and the app doesn't say this is a good time, Samuel. But, each hour of the day is assigned to a different planet. And depending on the length of day, right now, we are kind of in a liminal space with the fall, equinox being recent, but we're getting into a point where the nighttime hour, night is longer than day. And so if you divide the hours up, 12 and 12, the hours of daylight are going to be shorter than the hours of night. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so then the planets rotate in a fixed order through the week, and they'll repeat, again on Sunday. So you see what hour you're working with, how long you have, and that's just picking the time. Then you go through this purification process where you abstain from alcohol and sex and food, And you kind of pick your own.
How long would that go on for?
3 days is like kind of the golden key that a lot of books talk about, grimoires and things like that. But it can be, months at times, preparing for a ritual. And then there's a lot of, ceremonial vestments that you wear, like robes. You might make a paper crown. You might make different implements, tools, and things like that.
It's quite complex.
It's complex.
Maybe what you're talking about is more simple or earth-based.
But the interesting thing, though, is that with paganism, a lot of it was an oral tradition, and with ceremonial magic, a lot of it's written down. And what a lot of modern magicians are doing now is they are reading these books, but they're having to fill in the blanks because not everything's laid out in the grimoires. Like, there are certain things taken for granted in the books.
Okay, so when you say grimoires, can you explain that?
So these would be magical books. Grimoire is just any magical book. A magical journal could be considered a grimoire. But the grimoires I'm talking about would be ones that start around, let's say, like 2nd century BCE on up to like 1819. So it's a big chunk.
Ancient Greece, ancient Rome?
So starting in ancient Greece, and then over time, and then, you get to the...
Well, are they considered written by masters, so to speak, or...
They're anonymous.
They're anonymous?
They're supposedly written by Solomon. And so most of these grimoires will start out with a little paragraph about Solomon bestowing this wisdom on his son.
Oh, interesting.
And so it starts out with that. And so there's that kind of beginning, and then it usually go into something like the planetary hours and the angels of the hours and things like that.
Well, and how well, are you for sure that they're that old? Are they, is it kind of mysterious? Or they?
No, they have the actual, like the Greek magical papyri are a collection of papyrus scrolls that originate in Roman Egypt, written in the Greek language. Oh. And so it's a cultural amalgam, So those are kind of the first ones, and they have the evidence of those, and then the manuscripts that have survived, and the way that they survived was this clerical underground. So they survived because, in some ways, because and not because of the Christian church. So
in spite of,
yes. So there were monks and clerics and people that worked in lower office jobs for different churches, and they might have access to a library, and they're also not getting paid much, and so they need to make some extra cash. So they might do some magic for someone in town. And
they were very secret.
Very secret, clerical underground, and
that's amazing.
They would. And the only way they would get caught is if one of their clients or superiors found out. Usually, most of the witch trials had to do with a client being dissatisfied with the service they received from a magical practitioner.
Oh, that's
called
so
them
fascinating.
A witch and then they went to trial. So it was
they would pay someone and then they wouldn't work out.
Yeah, and then they would take them to trial.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's because they would say she, this person claimed that I was a thief too, and then that caused
that whole accusing someone of being a witch and pointing the finger, and then they would be tortured, and then they would have to be forced to admit to whatever it was, and then they would name 5 other people, and just it's such a dark side of human nature. So I guess a similar thing happened with communism or under Nazism at times, kind of witch hunts. We have our own version now. It's
hopefully it doesn't get worse.
Well, so you talked about angels and demons. To me, that sounds fairly Christian language. I'm guessing the demons are dark, or how do you? So are they negative spirits versus positive spirits?
You could see it that way. So a lot of my magic, starts in that Greek magical papyri before, pre-Christian. And so those were, a lot of pagan spirits. But angels still existed because you still had Judaism that influenced the Greek magical papyri too, or PGM. And so, yes, there is definitely a Christian kind of current to it, but with that, knowing that tradition of that clerical underground, it's kind of like you're oh, this is kind of a thing. This is part of the tradition.
It kind of transcends these different religions.
Yeah, and in some schools it's called working with both hands. You work with your left and your right. You work with your,
But that's such a big thing in Indian Tantra, the right hand path and the left hand path.
Yeah. And there's definitely some congruence to that too.
Don't the Christians, like medieval Christians, called the left-hand path sort of the way of the devil, right? Mm-hmm. The right-hand path is of God. What is it in
That's so
Hindu?
interesting. In India and Hinduism and Buddhism, the left-hand path is like this tantric path, basically, but it's a tantric path that that includes breaking societal norms, right? Like doing something taboo, purposefully, often in maybe a ritual context, in order to like transcend our social conditioning, to have some, break through the dualities we have, the ideas of good and bad. But it developed a really bad reputation in India overall. Whereas like a right-hand path is like more about purity, and you're like the Brahmins, and you're following the right diet and the right conduct, and there's the caste system and all that. And that all kind of got incorporated in Buddhism in different ways, at least into that, where there were these like, what's the word for it? You do like ways of going against societal norms, basically. Like you're like a religious practitioner isn't supposed to eat meat or drink alcohol. So in Tibetan Buddhist feast offerings, you make these like offerings. You do this practice traditionally like twice a month, and on a certain day. Mm-hmm. There's a day for a guru, which is like the masculine figure, and a day for the dakini, which is like the female, feminine wisdom. And you're supposed to eat like a small amount of meat and alcohol. Some people, when they do it, will drink a large amount of alcohol and eat a large amount of meat. But you're supposed to have at least one male and one female person present and consume at least a small amount of meat and alcohol. And it's kind of symbolic of not holding on too tightly to these ideas of good and bad. It's also an offering. It's also a way to connect with the animal that died. There's like different ways you can understand it. But there's these like enlightened deities or Buddhas that love meat, I guess. Make offerings to them. So it gets kind of complicated. But there's this idea of demons and angels. That's so interesting.
Yeah, they're definitely like they're spirits, and different. There's different places they kind of will habit, but really they can be kind of dangerous at times. Like
there's an element of danger.
Like there is an element of danger because they're trickster spirits, and so as a trickster spirit, and what I'll be doing is like I'll have a circle. I'll usually be in my in a space that's set up for the ritual, and I'll be in a circle that I've made. And there'll be times where if I'm invoking an angel, it'll show up. We'll have a conversation. It'll go, and we'll be good. But with a demon, they're going to be tricking you. So like there might be a crash in your kitchen, wanting you to leave the circle, or there might be
you're not supposed to leave the circle.
You have to really maintain this concentration through the whole thing, because usually you're fixed on a point where the spirit is. It could be in a reflective surface like a black scrying mirror, or a bowl of water, or a candle flame, or something like that. But you fix your attention during this invocation that you recite. And you're usually working up energy.
You're inviting it to come.
You're inviting it to come, into your space.
Why would you want to invite a demon?
So a lot of to go back to the Solomonic tradition, it's the story of Solomon and how he binds these different numbers, depending on the text of demons, and uses them to build the second temple. And so that's the storyline. He finds all these errant spirits, binds them, and then sends them to go to the quarries and dig the stones and move them and build the temple. But so these demons also do things, and so in some of the grimoires they might help you get money, find love, get luck, eloquence, things like this.
Okay, so Solomon bound the demons, like he forced them to
brass
do this.
vessel.
Oh, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
There's such similar stories in India and Tibet and about binding these spirits, or what you're going to call them, entities. Yeah. And then sometimes this story is like a great meditation master there'll be a negative spirit, and they'll bind them and somehow control them and make them convert to Buddhism. and then they'll make them promise to only do good and not hurt people, and then they'll release them. And then, but then it's thought that they're still kind of wild and still kind of dangerous, and they don't always do that exactly right. So you have to be careful around them.
Yeah. I think it's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so amazing, these similarities.
Yeah.
Well, so you're invoking some of these spirits, and you feel like you get to talk with them, or you can?
Yeah,
that's amazing.
They might do something where they're showing me images, in the scrying mirror. That's typically the easiest way of doing it. You can do things where you have like a puppet, like a doll or a figure, and you might set it up and have the spirit kind of focus on that area, and then it might move and talk. I mean, you really, and the thing is, you've altered your consciousness, and you've done it through the fasting and the purification, and there's usually a confession. And in my terms, like, confession is just owning up to myself, in front of my altar, all the times I was less than great, something like that.
These are like ritual elements.
They're ritual elements, and then really what puts you over the edge, though, is the invocations. Because there's lots of them, and they're pages long, and there's a lot of what they call barbarous words, which are these really difficult to pronounce words, often a lot of vowels and stuff. It originates with the PGM stuff.
So it's like a magic spell.
It's a magic spell, yeah. And the way you deliver it is with, your diaphragm and your voice. And so it can get very powerful. I think a lot of people think of it as like very sonorous and very sing-songy, but it's usually something very guttural and very, harsh.
It's so fascinating.
And so through that process of doing these invocations, like, you alter your own consciousness, but you also call it spirit too. There's one more point was like, Aleister Crowley, when he published a version of the Goetia, which is one of the main books of summoning these spirits, said, or kind of pontificated that, like, these spirits were actually pieces of the human psyche, and so they were our shadows, and so binding them would be binding your shadows and confronting them in the circle. And so that's another way you could think about it if you didn't want to think about it literally as these are spirits that you're inviting into your house.
So I love the psychological angle of, like, it's part of our psyche, it's connecting with parts of ourselves, and this idea of binding, like reconnecting.
Yeah.
But that's part of the rituals you're talking about, where you bind them?
Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear about.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, it's like a million things I could ask you, but in the spirit of this conversation, like, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's so many similar elements. There's these ritual elements. So, like, you talk about the circle, like a protection circle. So in a Buddhist practice, Tantric Buddhist practice, they'll often have a circle, and it's often you're just doing it in your imagination or visualization. But I think, in monasteries and places that are more dedicated to that kind of practice, they would have, physical barriers. And so there's that. There's the confession is certainly part of that, like, cleansing, the prayers, then saying mantras, of course, is a huge part of it, and that sounds similar to and the word for mantra literally translates as like magic spell, right? It's often not translated that way. We just use the word mantra. Mantra is a Sanskrit word, but if you had to find an English word, the word spell is like the best word that, like the literal meaning is. It's a magical syllables, magical vowels that have some power, that are connected with a certain deity or Buddha, and then you invoke them in, and then you make offerings to them, and then in the Buddhist case, you often imagine yourself like embodying it, and maybe that's similar to the binding thing in a certain way. But you imagine you are that Buddha, and you have those qualities, and it's an interesting, like, just psychologically, that you're trying to become a Buddha. You're trying to open up your compassion and your wisdom, and so it's kind of a way of tricking your mind into, like, oh, I'm already there, but then I can already act that way, rather than I have to wait till the next lifetime or whatever it is, or pray for 1,000,000 years. It's like you can already be it here and now. So it has this quality of immediacy, and then you dissolve the whole thing into emptiness. So it's like comes out of emptiness and dissolves back into emptiness. And I guess the Buddhist people out there, if they were going to debate, they would say, well, these traditions you're talking about, they don't have the emptiness or the great compassion, or that would be like a more polemical thing. I don't know if that's true or not, but Buddhism makes a big deal about this quality of everything being empty of self, empty of inherent nature. And so out of this empty space that is our true nature, different things can manifest. So I don't know enough about what you're talking about to know, like, is there a goal of awakening or enlightenment? Or
so the enlightenment part would come from the angels. That would come from the instruction of the angels. That would come from contacting the right ones, developing relationships with them. Like an angel like Michael would be a good example. Michael's a really amazing angel, has a long history, predating Christianity. And you might ask Michael to help you, acquire new work or, learn a new skill. There's actually a grimoire called the Ars Notoria that is all about like using angels to learn new things. And you can learn new languages with these angels too. There are people that do it. There are people that work through them and actually get to that point. And the emptiness that you talk about doesn't happen a lot, though. I will say that's not necessarily.
But doesn't Crowley write in, like we're just thinking about magic and theory and practice, he talks about this like sort of universal consciousness, this connectivity that certain initiates can aspire to and achieve. And I think it comes from the Eastern influence. Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a piece that is missing from the grimoires, and I will say that like learning how to meditate really helped me in the circle. I don't think that I would have gotten it as quickly or as efficiently if I hadn't learned how to meditate.
That seems like an important point.
Yeah.
And I feel the same with my Zen training, and whenever I'm trying to I do some chaos magic work, which is primarily with something called sigils, right? You take, or you can go beyond a sigil to a servitor, but you're essentially trying to get an outcome by putting your will out into the universe and manipulating the energies. And the way that you sort of infuse your will is through these meditative states. A lot of people use orgasm is like the moment where so a sigil itself is a word. Often folks will take out the vowels or not. You just obscure the word, changing it to where it just becomes a symbol, right? And then you look at this symbol, and when you have these moments where you kind of break free of duality, where you're more of a clear mind. You can hit it through meditation, you can hit it through orgasm or fasting or whatever. At the peak point, you just visualize the sigil, right? And you infuse it. And then you do this repeatedly, and you can do it around astrological cycles or moon cycles. And then you decide, okay, today's the day, I'm going to release this thing. And you can get, if you have a group of practitioners, you can work together to release this, or you can do it yourself. Often I burn the sigil at the end when you want to, or, the servitor, which is kind of like a little, imp that you create to go do a task repeatedly till it's done. Oh yeah. And you feed those things with blood, with semen, whatever you got to keep throwing it at it, and then you release it, it goes off to do your task. And I'm not ashamed, but a little ashamed maybe to say that I set this up to knock some sense in the head of a particular person. And that weekend she had a snowboarding accident and left her with a concussion. And I just thought, oh wow, or knock some of the arrogance out of her. That's what I wanted. And I don't normally curse people, but I was really upset at that particular person. I was going through a phase where I was really exploring this shadow side. Yeah.
Where you did that accident happened.
Oh yeah.
Wow, that's wild.
It is. So it's just about infusing will, and maybe that's pretty dark for your listeners. But again, it's about exploring the shadow side, the shadow self, and then seeing what that produces.
Well, and your intention was to knock sense into them. So
yeah. See, I always try to make it be a healing. Ultimately, if I get upset and want to do something, maybe it was. Maybe on some level, it knocked some of the arrogance out of her.
I mean, that's a hell of a story. Just that there's these technologies of our consciousness that can have effects in the world.
Metzger, is that his name or no? Who's the guy who started disinformation? Oh my gosh. Anyway, this guy became a consultant to corporations about sigils because he noticed things like McDonald's golden arches.
Oh, wow.
That's a sigil.
Logos.
Yeah, logos. And so these people pay him big money to go in and, help them, craft a logo, talk about what was working, what's not working. But, yeah. And when you think about McDonald's, right, boom, right in your head come the golden arches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one obviously worked.
Yeah, and it worked on a massive level, like a thought virus almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people keep feeding energy in, and
Oh.
But in Tibetan Buddhism, is there any kind of meditations over particular? Because I know one thing we haven't talked about yet is Kabbalism, which comes from like the Jewish tradition. It's like a Jewish mystical tradition of like taking words and converting them into numbers, and those numbers representing then like, you know, kind of higher spiritual notions or ideas.
I met some people who are really into the whole number thing. I'm not as into that, but yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I think if you talk to most people, they have this idea that like, oh, magic is something people believed in the past, and now we have science, and that was all just a big waste of time. And I wonder if our culture is shifting or evolving to be able to integrate or include some of these things. Like I think there is some efficacy, even if it's only on in a subjective sense of shifting our own consciousness. You know?
Anything they can commodify will be commodified. It was like, going to oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Like this black rights activist. Oh, I can't even remember his name. He was queer, lived over in Europe. Oh, I'm drawing a total blank. It's shameful. But he had said, you know, black people in America will have their day to a certain extent because they are consumers. And he was saying this in the 50s, you know, pre-civil rights.
Yeah, so our capitalist society will co-opt things, and I guess with the new age, everything, there's so much in the marketplace. And
but mysticism never can be commodified. It cannot. And that's where Harry Potter, you know, they're at a school, they learn things, but they have these natural abilities. It's not like putting in the time, like, and the sort of self-torture that can kind of go into achieving.
It's a lot of discipline. What you guys are talking about.
Yeah.
And obviously Buddhism too.
Yeah.
And yoga and all these. Yeah. I think that's where Hollywood and the actual practitioners of these things are totally, you know, they're so different, right? Like in Hollywood, I noticed that when I watched one of the newer Star Wars movies, like the character just immediately was like born or just spontaneously with the Force and like moving stuff around. I was like, oh man, I wanted to see her training. I wanted to see her teacher. I wanted to see her learning and developing, because it's not, I think it's putting an unrealistic idea in people's heads that like some people are just born that way, or some people are, if you talk to anyone who's successful, they work really hard at it. You know, like
absolutely,
like Michael Jordan or whatever example you want. Like it's not like he didn't make his high school basketball team. I mean, it's fucking amazing. But then he somehow used that to like light this intense fire in himself, where he like the rest of his life he played with this huge chip on his shoulder. Like he always, and when he felt like no one could stop him, he retired. He retired twice. Like I think 3 times. He's a crazy guy. My point is like no one worked harder than he did to get there. And there is natural gifts and abilities and all that too. Like they go together, obviously, but this idea that we could train, that's like the really revolutionary idea, that we can evolve, that we can develop, that we can access these things for ourselves.
It's the hero's journey.
Yeah, and that's what I think our society, I don't know, we're not always, I mean, in some ways we know that, but in other ways we think that these things are impossible for us, or we see these movies where like people just have this magical ability or whatever it is, or they're a superhero that they were like touched by radioactive waste. But I think that, like, if we look at all the superhero stuff, there's usually like a deep symbolism there. Like the radioactive waste that made them into a superhero, like that, they went through like torture, and then they came out the other end. Yeah, they went through a crucible. So.
Yeah, and that's like, you know, again, it's archetypal mythic, and that's something that gets very easily removed from the capitalist machine. You know, they use it to a limited extent with films or like, you know, other commodities, toys, whatever. That, like, you know, it'll be like an archetypal figure maybe, but you know, they accelerate that process. It's strange how everything is just like very quickly produced. It's fast and cheap, and there you go, in our society. And people, I think, like with the pandemic, part of how folks aren't able to process it, some people, is because they think they can just buy their way out of anything.
Right.
And this is like, you know, the way that our society is so death avoidant, which Samuel and I were talking about before.
That's a great point.
Yeah, they just really like, you you want to be able to just like, oh, boom, you have the talent, boom, you're at the top, this is great. It also feeds the American myth of the individual, like, that, one person alone can accomplish all these things just because they have a natural talent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely a death-avoidant culture, and we want to use money to solve everything. And I think for me, like, the sadness of it is like, we learn all this stuff, and we have all these brilliant people like working so hard, and the whole point of it is just to earn more money. And there are other examples of other cultures and societies that had other goals. Like, there was more to life than just consuming everything,
Mm-hmm.
more to life than just stacking up your bank account. And I think we've just lost touch with other possibilities and other realities and other ways of happiness and well-being that could support life on this whole planet, that could not be about a competition, that could not be about getting more for yourself and consuming more. And
everybody falls into it, because even if you have a different intention, the cost of living here is just intense. It's far more expensive. Even people told me when I went to the UK, you're going to spend all this money. This was just like a year and a half ago, and I lived on $300 for an entire month because I shopped at the grocery stores, and I could get a loaf of bread for 24 pence if it was like the end of the day, and I got like a whole block of Stilton cheese for £1.50. I mean, that's like the equivalent of like a couple bucks US.
Well,
and
I always heard England was more expensive.
Maybe at the restaurants, but I was just going to the Tesco's, and it was fine. But over here, how much would I went shopping for a block of Stilton cheese, you might pay $8 to $15.
Mm-hmm.
A loaf of bread, if you get like the same quality bread I bought over there, probably $5 or $6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've created a society where if you have money, like, things really can work well here for you, I think, in general. But if you're struggling for money, or you feel like you don't have it, or you're not getting more coming in all the time, it's easy to start to feel overwhelmed and hopeless, and it affects our sense of self-worth, and just there's so much there.
And you work and work for next to nothing. And then where is the time for spiritual pursuit or reflection?
Yeah, the timepiece.
Mm-hmm.
And even churches want money.
Everyone wants money.
Yeah.
I think back, Lisa Jane, when we were reading Apocalyptic Witchcraft, and how Peter Gray was talking about the state of the world, talking about the environmental crisis and things like this, and how he paralleled it with medieval times and the desperation, the starvation, the hunger, all these things that on some level, we have the material things, but there's still the hunger. There's still this lack, and it's on many levels. But out of that need comes witchcraft. Comes this idea that there is a Sabbath to go to at night. There is a feast waiting for you when you close your eyes and go to dreamland, which is kind of what that whole thing was about. It was about dreams. Yeah, well, when the witches were going to the Sabbaths and stuff, they weren't actually, meeting up. They were going to the dreamland, and they were experiencing feasts and these spirits and this revelry and things like that. And you can think of it as kind of an escapism. It can definitely go into that. Just like ceremonial magic with all of the robes and garments and pieces can go into a very materialistic, direction. But when you consider like the personal growth and development of it, it becomes something else. It transforms. So again, it's you can go either way. You can go that consumeristic route, or you can stay the course. But
well, in the role of imagination, right? That's another big thing that I think connects so much what we're talking about, where you're using your imagination, visualization, imagination, something that so many of us lose touch with, but we all have when we're kids, right? I used to live in whole fantasy worlds when I'm a little kid, playing in the sandbox or whatever, and then when we get older, we stop doing that, and we think it's not real, and dreams too.
Or you think it's you're told it's silly. You're wasting your time.
Right.
Daydreams are a waste of time, and it's awful because it's such a part of who we are as a species. It's how we interact with the world. Yeah. But the fantasies even become co-opted, because how many people are out there fantasizing about this car or that body or this lifestyle instead of using that to explore other areas, get into a more kind of mythic archetypal story mode, or like a kid will just so naturally go to that.
Yeah, it's interesting, this like critique of capitalism that's
sorry, this is like being a pagan green anarchist. I'm sorry, it's bringing in like
Well, we're so, I don't know, we're in the water we swim in. Our culture is, the water that we swim in. It's, I think when most people think about what they want or the will, like they think they want $1 billion in their bank account, like that's what they want.
Yeah, right.
And, it's hard to get out of that or see other options. But I think we all, capitalism is good at some things, I think, and it's good at, in some ways we have more abundance than we ever had before. We have all this technology, we have all this food in our grocery stores, we have all this stuff that we can order online, like there's all these...
But we also have more people starving than we ever have in history.
Yeah, it's such a mixed picture.
It sure is. And speaking about, going back to like folk magic, a lot of the hoodoo traditions, that's so much about like quick fixes they're like imaginative visualizations that bring about quick solutions using certain props, or going like there's often a particular person in a community that folks might go to get like powders or oils that are going to help them achieve these like very pragmatic things, whether it's
very practical or real life oriented magic. I think that's true of a lot of indigenous cultures that I've seen and heard about and experienced to some degree, where it's like something went missing, and like what you're talking about, like somebody can, like the shaman or whoever, can like use their abilities to like somehow know where it is, maybe, or it hasn't rained in a month, and like we do this thing and hope for rain.
Well, and now, like with such a like global ecological crisis, I feel like part of why I define myself as pagan green anarchist is that a lot of my work is trying to commune with like earth elementals or energies and see where things can be done for help, or like hear their voices conveying like messages. Yeah, and I use psychedelics to help me get there.
That's
quite
a whole
a bit too.
Topic we haven't really gotten into.
We haven't stepped into that one. Yeah.
So you use psychedelics to help you with your spiritual practice, right?
Yeah, actually, like I kind of was led to this through a dream, oddly enough, of like these fairy folk. Right, I had a very specific dream, and it happened to take place on a like pagan religious holiday, Beltane, which I had not connected to the dream until after I woke and like was talking to someone, and they said, "Oh, you had that dream then?" It was the spring, not the equinox. My mind is just so shot today, but it's like happening on this holiday, and through like meditation and taking psychedelics, I've had different visions of these entities, and they repeat. It's not as if it's like they're one time and then it's a new one the next time. It seems pretty grounded to these like creatures that kind of exist in a world beyond our world but are still a part of it. Yeah.
Is this through like a ritual or ceremony?
I generally set an intention before I go into like a psychedelic session, and I've had them both indoors and outdoors.
Interesting. But you've seen some of the same things have come to you in different dreams.
Yeah. Well, not in the dreams, in the psychedelic experiences. The dreams when they hit are very specific, but with the psychedelic experiences, I keep getting this message repeatedly, and it's like a little bit weird to say, I guess. I don't know, for the podcast, I didn't know that I wanted to go there, but humanity, I was told, like, as of last October, humanity is nearing an end as you know it, and be ready. This was October 2019. And
dark prophecy there.
Yeah, but they were saying the time of man, patriarchal man, is over, and it's going to be an era of the female compassionate warrior taking lead. Yeah. So I hope that's the outcome.
I think that's been developing on a bigger level for some time. Like, there's more equality than ever before. Like, more women can read across the whole world, or in positions of leadership. And I read this fascinating thing a long time ago saying that the written word is more masculine, more the masculine energy, and like visual imagery is more feminine, and the advent of TV and now the internet and our phones and all these photos and videos are like people are watching way more movies now instead of reading novels, and they were connecting that to this like shift to a more feminine-centered leadership and to the patriarchy. I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting perspective, but and I was really on board with all that until Trump got reelected. I was like, oh no!
But you know, it's almost like it's going to like the far extreme of the pendulum, right? It's like it has to get there before it can collapse. And I mean, Trump himself, he's a caricature. He's not. It's almost like he's sort of like an irreal figure, you know. He's out of a he's a Disney film.
To some people, some people he's a hero. I don't know.
Right. A hero of what though? What does he represent for that? And that is again about like this obsession with control and oppression being okay, exploitation being okay. I just think the people who follow him think that they're exempt from the exploitation or the oppression. Just like a lot of the followers of Stalin probably felt like when we take this revolution to the next level, we're going to be exempt. And then look at who got rounded up and shot after all the, like, they'd gone through all the whites. They fought with the Tsar. I don't know. These are strange times. But I think what you say, though, about, like, you know, the women think more visually, that the written word is a more masculine thing. I think that's it's a hard call to make.
Maybe that's not accurate. I don't know.
Because education has often been like a privilege of like the male gender, like over
historically.
Historically. But women have carried like folk traditions, like herbalism, healing arts. Yeah. These things have kind of carried down generationally and in communities through women.
Maybe more oral traditions, right?
Yeah. Well, hands-on.
There's something about the written word where it's like a text is written 2,000 years ago and it doesn't change. Like that actual letters on it, maybe the meaning we make of it or understanding. But I don't know. Some people really don't like looking at things in terms of masculine and feminine or yin and yang. But like this quality of like being unchanging and unmoving is a more masculine yang quality. And like the flow and the change and oral tradition where like the words are passed and then a generation goes by and then the words are passed, but they're different words. They're from a new person. The message could be the same, but there's more flow or more fluidity. So
yeah, it evolves through history.
But I really do think we are moving to a more feminine and compassionate based kind of way of being in leadership, like in our collective consciousness. And I don't think the election of one president or another changes that. I think it's a much bigger like tidal shift. And maybe Trump getting elected is a reaction against that. But we're definitely like we're all aware that we're part of this globe together. Like globalism isn't really something we can stuff. We can't put the genie back in the bottle and pretend we're the only country in the area. So like, just that, and our Earth is round, and no one can pretend. I mean, I guess there's the flat earthers, but basically, no one can pretend not to know that the Earth is round and round again. I mean, I think there's a tremendous power and significance in that we live in a sphere. We don't live in a flat plane. You know, we live in a sphere, like in space with other spheres.
Yeah.
So, to me, that's kind of connected with this more feminine wisdom or more receptive way of being. But I think, then I think about like ceremonial magic. That seems like a more masculine way of, if we're going to use that language.
Yeah, I think that traditionally it has been. That was kind of its foundation, and that's how a lot of people kind of see it. But I would say though that. Around the turn of the century when, the turn of the 19th century when you had things like the Golden Dawn and later Thelema and things like this, there was definitely more of a push to, include women into those circles. And it's, there's definitely still, I would agree that it's a very male-dominated scene. But I don't think that is a part of the tradition. If you see what I'm saying. Like, it's not that masculinity is a prerequisite to ceremonial magic. It's just that is, it was founded on that historically, but that is not how it could, end up. Right. And really, when you get to something like, so with the invention of the printing press, and then you have, France in, during the Revolution and things like this, there were a series of these blue book grimoires that were printed, and they were really cheap. They were called Blue Book because it was this blue cheap pulp that they used to print them. But they were in every person's grimoire. So there were love spells for men and women. Oh. There were different protocols for carrying the book, because just carrying a magical book is a magical act in itself. The book is magical itself, and
it says that in the book.
It would say, like women would carry it in left or right pocket, and men would carry it in the opposite. Like there's this kind of distinction, and the spells kind of reflect both genders as well. So it's something that definitely needs to transform, and women need to be included more into ceremonial circles. And I look forward to more women authors of ceremonial magic. I think that perspective has been missing for a long time, and it'd be very refreshing to see because a lot of ceremonial magic is very solar, and what would that look like from a lunar perspective?
Right.
What would that be? I can postulate, but that would be a man doing it. So
there's an evolution happening in development.
Yeah, there is.
Were these books that were being printed, would they be secret or illegal?
They would be illicit. Yeah, you would not want an authority or someone. This was after the Inquisition, but they wouldn't be in the front window of a bookseller. They'd be in the back, and they'd probably be under the counter.
Secret knowledge.
Yeah. But you could obtain these, and that's how, again, that tradition was got to this point. Because that when you think about what survived, a lot of these books were victims of burning.
Actual book burnings.
Book burning, yeah.
Crazy.
They were confiscated and destroyed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that I've heard in terms of religious history in Buddhism, I think the same is true in any patriarchal cultures. There were these great women practitioners and masters and yoginis, but maybe their stories weren't written down, or maybe they're not remembered as much. Maybe back to the written word, who's writing the text, who's getting the control, who reads and who writes. That's such a significant thing in cultural history. So,
well, didn't the Gautama Buddha, his aunt really wanted to be a part of the movement, and so she shaved her head and followed around his group. He kept saying no, no, and then finally he said, after 8 years, I believe, he said she could be a part of it, but there were these 200 some odd additional rules, extra rules for women. Yeah, It's funny how
it's not the best side of that story, but
yeah,
I've heard it explained that the Buddha was concerned that it would disrupt the social order too much if daughters ran away from their families. But somehow, the son running away was more acceptable because the woman was considered a property that they would
use to get.
So it's it's not a good history.
No, but it's the way that human culture developed.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to note that this kind of patriarchy, this kind of seeing men as somehow better, women as lower, goes across the globe. It's not just Western Europe. So it kind of drives me crazy when some people criticize European white people, patriarchy. It's there's so much patriarchy in Tibet. It's the word into the Tibetan language for woman literally translates as a lesser born.
Oh man!
So there you go. There's the patriarchy right there. In this otherwise, very, in some ways, very beautiful, pristine society that was in harmony with nature and that had all these good qualities. It also has that kind of stuff going on.
It's naturally misogynistic.
It was misogynistic, but then in the Tantra, the left-hand path, it said women were considered higher. So women have more natural wisdom than men. And that part of if you all men should respect women, and so it's
secret knowledge.
And I had both, yeah. The secret knowledge.
but what's funny is that the role of the hermaphrodite, right? The non-binary. I think kind of across cultures, it's sort of a revered figure, right? I mean, how is that? Have you ever heard of mention of hermaphroditism in Tibet? Or
I've been wondering about that, and I want to learn more. Not specifically that I know of, but there is very much a tradition of imagining yourself as a female Buddha or a male Buddha or two Buddhas in union. So there is this playing with gender and a meditation level to try to overcome your identity. But honestly, I don't really know of a hermaphrodite in that context, and I'm sure there's people out there that have looked into that more, but that's my
Yeah, because I think with like occult practice, the hermaphrodite is often represented this sort of transcendent being, the sacred entity. Yeah. And when you think about how many people, at least here in like the Denver Boulder area, that consider themselves non-binary.
Yeah,
right?
Well, that's been such a growing thing. Like, it seems like more and more people are identifying that way.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I mean it's pleasant to think about like a culture where there are folks that really kind of operate genderlessly. Yeah, that there's that.
Or they're choosing a new gender or a different gender.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because part of how patriarchal society keeps its hold is that it's very strictly like binary.
Mm-hmm. Like you're either one or the other.
One or the other, yeah. Just
that's
based
interesting.
on a set of sex organs. But again, that could come back to how people begin to navigate the world. And when we think about the way that spirituality develops, right? How gender seems to almost always come into it and play a role in terms of
it's such a big topic.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I think our culture is obviously evolving and changing. I guess like one way that I kind of think about this stuff is whatever gender you identify with, like you could still look at the world in terms of these masculine or feminine or yin and yang qualities that you could embody in different ways and different combinations, or maybe at different times you feel more one or the other, and it's a limited, it is a kind of duality, and the world is more complex than that. And you could talk about, different philosophies. Maybe they break the world down into 3 kind of essential qualities, like in Ayurveda, or maybe there's a lot more than that. But for some reason, humans, I think it might be connected with the fact that our brain is divided into 2 hemispheres. Like we tend to see things like the sun and the moon, or yin and yang, like that's definitely across time and culture to kind of make, and I think it's a way we make sense of the world. I don't think it's like the absolute truth of things, but there's something to it.
Well, it's definitely tied to Western languages. When you think about Eastern languages, I don't know so very much about it, but I know with, let's say, Japanese, the verb and the noun, like the subject and the verb, are sometimes the same. Like it's one word to express both. So there's this greater unity, which I think just the way we speak, there's always an opposite. In almost any word you give, there's an opposite. Me, you, black, white, table, chair. It's just there's always something that's different to juxtapose it to.
There's the action and the object. And
we really break
it apart like that.
Yeah.
And then some languages like French and Spanish, like all the words are gendered. Right?
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
And
we
don't have that. Sometimes in German has like a neuter article or whatever. It's.
And to think that a lot of these these languages developed out of church, Christian church, and how that was kind of thing. Because I mean, the ancient Greeks did not have a very dualistic society. They had a very pantheistic, you were talking about, and so the idea of the binary thing had to come in at some point, and there's different, religious Christian texts you can read, and it's like, they even made a graph in a couple of them, where it was this is higher than this is and they just these opposites, and I think that's kind of a driving piece too, and so we're back to that, topic of Christianity and how it, kind of skewed things over the course of its history.
It's our history, can't escape it. If someone's listening and wants to learn more about paganism or ceremonial magic, or what other kind of words would it, Wiccan, I guess would that be ceremonial magic? What kind of maybe you could we
could do that.
Just quickly, we've been going for a while here.
So so for me, I wouldn't consider what I do paganism, and I really wouldn't consider it Christianity either, because it's not really Orthodox Christianity, but it definitely rides that line a little bit. But it's Wicca is more of an earth-based pagan, religion, and then there's also the term neo-paganism, which comes into play too, which can
get political too in a weird way.
But it's what I practice is a little bit different. You would call it ceremonial magic or ritual magic.
Is high magic a phrase that gets used?
High magic can be used, yeah. And that's, I think, a very common term to use.
What about occultism? Is that?
Occultism would be, for me, occultism is finding the secrets in the ordinary. It's kind of recognizing the symbolism or symbology of everyday items or things or places or people, that there's an occulted meaning to it. Just like, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, when I think of like the Eucharist of like the Christian church, like you have the bread and the wine, and those are symbols, and they have an exoteric meaning, which is, this is the body and blood of Jesus. Like, this is the, we're going to say that it became it when I, wave my hands over it. And so it's an exoteric symbol of the Christian faith, or like the crosses. But then there's these other meanings to it. So looking at the cross and correlating the Hebrew word tau, or the Hebrew letter tau, as a cross, which doesn't it mean nail?
Yeah.
It's a rabbit hole on an item where there's all this meaning, and usually there's even folklore built up into it, stories, things like that. That's what I think of as occultism. And so knowing all those like ins and outs and that secret knowledge.
Well, I think there's just another way to approach it, though, which is that, with the Age of Reason, all the ceremonial magic kind of had to go underground. And so there were these initiatory rites in place to make, that you had to go through before you were handed certain knowledge, like within the Golden Dawn or the Thelemic traditions, right? And then it's also, it's kind of about like, it's hidden. So you have to be a seeker, or like be conscious when it comes to you. If it seeks you, that's the moment. Or if you're not ready, then it goes away. So like I think that sort of quality of hiddenness. But I see what you're saying, Samuel. It's like like a broader spectrum of the how you can look at the word. But I think for like if somebody was to Google occultism, they would probably get like everything from UFOs to Satanism. It's just
interesting. We haven't even gotten into the whole world of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, we don't have to go there.
Sort of just like,
although the Illuminati, right? That's like part of it.
Right. It's such a fascinating. We could talk for hours.
Oh, completely.
Because there were these pagan and magical and ritualistic things that were driven underground, but then there were people that would meet presumably in secret to talk about it and practice it. So like some of these conspiracy theories, they have some basis in fact. Like there probably was some group that called themselves the Illuminati. They probably are alive now.
No, there absolutely was. It's not even a question of maybe.
I don't know much about the history of it.
Yeah, what was that guy's name who really he took them over with this intent for like revolt and revolution. They were like a subgroup of the Freemasons, right? They were trying to like unify Freemasons around Europe. And what's his name? Adam Haupt, Haupt, I think is what his name was. Who like led the group of Freemasons that declared themselves Illuminati, that tried to. This is like historical fact. This isn't me like with a conspiracy theory. But it pissed a lot of people off because he started taking it in weird directions. And so the Freemasons were like, okay, we're back to just being Freemasons. Which were generally like a secret society and a community that people could use to network. It's
I think of it too as there's an initiation process too, and we were kind of touching on initiation earlier, but like the initiation of like, I remember when I read Aleister Crowley for the first time, and it was the Book of Lies, and it made no sense whatsoever. It was just and these are poems, and there's all this esoteric knowledge put into these poems.
The Book of Lies?
The Book of Lies. It's a really good book. I mean, it almost somewhat borders on Eastern poetry because
completely.
It very much kind of like haiku. He was very good with words, and he could construct gnosis out of words. And the first time I read it, it didn't make any sense at all. And I was just like, this is just an occult book. Years later, after working through it, I can pick it up and I could explain it to someone. Or when I think about like, the difference between before and after learning something. But like, there's a lot revealed.
You've gone through this process, and now you can explain.
Yeah.
Well, so to get back to my question of like, if someone wanted to learn more about all this, like, or if someone was interested in
learning more about this,
like going down this path that you're talking about, like, what would you like? How did you just kind of start reading things and following the thread?
It was definitely being exposed to a little bit of occultism. Taking the bait and going with it, and really, there's a lot of self-study, and I think that. For me, I've had teachers over the years, but unlike, I think, a lot of traditions that are very much instruction-based, this one is very much self-determined, self-study. There's a lot of that. I've practiced with other folks that do Solomonic magic, or, I've attended, lectures or talks or things like this, met with people, but there was never... not until something like you join an order like the OTO would you really have an initiation. You're going to be self-initiating for a long time unless you do that.
What you do is a little more individual or more self-determined.
It's a little bit of both these days. Interesting. It started out very much, but I would say like if someone were interested in it, to check out Aleister Crowley, look into the Golden Dawn order. Some of the books that came out of that, and
Robert Anton Wilson,
Austin Osman Spare, looking into that, even just picking up the Key of Solomon and just leafing through it would be kind of
there's
a taste of what it
no
would
prohibition against looking at these texts.
No.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and then I guess my other big question is like the role of like ethics, morality. Like we were talking before the recording about like compassion in Buddhism and how that's so emphasized, and how like I've heard so many Buddhist teachers say like what makes something Buddhist or not is that understanding or insight into emptiness and compassion. So you have to have like a compassionate motivation, and if you lose that compassionate motivation, then you're no longer on the path. At least in Buddhism, it's like So they like, I think...
No, it's not like that. I just told you about putting something on a person who got slapped upside the head. I mean, it's a
little more free and kind of a Wild West.
Well, some practices would say they're on like what they call, there's like this rule of threes, right? Like, so whatever you put out in the universe comes back to you in threefold. Oh. So you should be careful about doing that. Yeah, it's similar to karma. But then a lot of magic came out of desperation, right? Not ceremonial magic, which has this tradition, but I think a lot of folks, they felt very disempowered, especially when we talk about witchcraft or we talk about folk traditions. Mm-hmm. It was to help control things that seem to be out of the control.
A way of taking your power back.
It's a way of taking your power back, yeah. And so, I think that in itself often involves like maybe some destructive impulses or anger. You know, witchcraft, like paganism, because nature itself is so, it contains both, like things that humans, it can be destructive and it can be like, just life-giving. So we work with both these types of energies. Mm-hmm. It's when it swings too far in one direction, like there's like a ton of oppression, let's say, like does like throwing something life-giving at complete oppression end the oppression? Not always, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the history, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the history of Tibet kind of speaks to a culture that really did emphasize compassion. It had really no standing army. They weren't trying to make war on anyone, and they got completely overrun by the Chinese and brutally oppressed. And a lot of indigenous people, had that. So what do you do in that? What does it mean to be compassionate there? Like maybe if they'd had an army, and maybe if they'd had arrangements with other countries and blah, 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 maybe they could have defended themselves. But as it was, they didn't. And then like all the indigenous people in this land, like got overrun. And so. Yeah,
and that's where it gets to a gray zone. Like, you think of the term compassion being like, having care for all beings. Well, what if the only way to show that care is to push back? think about Martin Luther King Jr. He was considered this great pacifist activist, but he was there on the front lines. He was doing marches. When he got shot in Memphis, he was there for like a garbage man's union strike. He was there showing support by being out there with the workers. And that kind of thing, you wonder, okay, well, that's not exactly entirely peaceful. It's showing,
It's disrupting the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think too, there's, with the spirits that we deal with, I think of them as amoral. I think of them as morally ambiguous. And I think that that's kind of a theme that a lot of witches take on, is this kind of, it depends on the situation, and there's, I'm sure that, people have their morals and things like that, and the things they hold important. And that is definitely an important thing for Solomonic magic, because we're using the books of Solomon. So the Psalms and the Proverbs and the books that supposedly Solomon wrote
in the Bible
as kind of as a guide. But at the same time, like I said, working with both hands, you're going to get them dirty. And so there's kind of this there may be a case where a hex or a curse is justified. And it doesn't necessarily need to be judged worthy or not by the church. So it's kind of this moral ambiguity, not as a free pass to do whatever you want, not do whatever you want. It's do what thou wilt. What is your will telling you to do?
Your higher,
what is your higher self telling you to do?
Okay.
Because if you really have a handle on that force, you're not going to be led astray, because it's the higher power. It's not going to lead you to your ruin.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad we're touching on this, because there's been a little bit of an elephant in the room feeling for me in this whole conversation of there's such a bad, I don't know, there's all these stigmas against a lot of what we're talking about. People think of witches and all the horror movies and all the negativity and even the word demon or angel. There's all this connotations with people causing harm or havoc or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're talking with you all, it's not really about that. Obviously, it's a more complex, nuanced thing.
Yeah, for sure there are witches that, and in a lot of other cultures, witch has this meaning of the other, and so witches aren't necessarily all human at that point. So someone could be a witch, usually an outsider or something like that. There's been some initiations, I guess you could say, that have initiated them beyond human. And so they would be very, possibly dangerous people to be around. They probably would harm you if you pushed them to it. And so it's not like witches are all, Instagram witches, I guess, you could say.
What is an Instagram?
But there is kind of this other element to it, because you have the village outsider, you have the person living on the fringe. The fringe could be a holy man, it could be a holy woman, it could be a shaman, it could be any one of those, and depending on how the village treats them and views them, that is the distinction. So someone could be a shaman, but if the village is all pissed off at them, they could be a witch then.
Yeah.
Your status can change as a shaman.
There's a certain element of power and danger that could go in different ways. And there's this story in the Bible of Jesus overturning the money tables and showing real anger, and I think it says he beats them and runs them out of the temple. So
yeah.
That's so even in our, even in that idea of this perfect person, there's a place for righteous anger and all that. So it's interesting. I like what you said about them being morally ambiguous. It's almost like just natural forces. A hurricane comes through. Yeah. We can't really say it's morally good or bad, because it's this force of nature. Yeah. And I think some of what you're speaking to is like that. It's just, if you push a rock down a hill and you're standing at the bottom, you might get hurt. Right. But it's not, that was gravity, and that was...
Yeah. It's kind of definitely that concept of nature, and in a way embracing unknowing. Embracing the unknowing of nature and the violence and beauty of nature, and incorporating them and really I find it very much stepping into nature is just kind of a push, and it just becomes you.
Talking about integration, you know,
integrating the two sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And like these impulses we have, you know, we have these very kind of basic, naturally driven impulses, and then we have like our rational minds, right? You know, Freud would say the id, the ego, the superego.
Right.
You know, we're just, you know, I guess looking to integrate.
Right.
And I think
if you cut off the id, if you cut off your animal instincts and passion, and you're trying to be perfect all the time, you lose your life force, you lose your ability to really make an impact, and you fragment yourself. And
like,
so if we want to really evolve and develop, we want to integrate and find what I think is like a higher form of development that does greater good, but that can include some of these opposites.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah,
it's been a long one.
Yes, I'll give you some suggested reading material too for the link when we give you our little bios. But thank you so much, Julian, for having us here. And it was a fun talk.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks for being on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at A State of Mind. Come to our website at stateofmindplay.com. Send us a message. Let us know what you think. And if you would like to support this podcast, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/A State of Mind. And if you would like to learn more about my work as a therapist, coach, meditation teacher, and speaker, check out julianocean.us. Thank you so much, and I will see you here next time.